Erev Tov, everybody. Thanks for joining in so close to Pesach. A week from tonight is Seder night, and our topic has nothing to do with that, as best as I can tell. So it's a credit to all of you to divert our attention from Pesach preparations to Parashat Shavua, where we are immersed in tzara'at, in the phenomenon, however it's translated or explained, of this skin affliction, which of course manifests not just on skin, as we'll see tonight, but also on fabrics and also on the walls of homes. I'm going to share my screen and we will dive right in. This is the second of Nechama's essays on Metzora, called Tzara'at of Houses. And she begins, as she sometimes does. We're accustomed to seeing, this section, a quote of Hebrew psukim, usually within the first sentence or two. But here we get a slightly more programmatic introduction to guide us in what we're about to read. She says, "It is a literary truism that style is not merely a garb for the idea, an outer shell for the kernel, nor is its function just to embellish and adorn the subject. Style, syntactic structure, choice of words and their arrangement, length and brevity, all form part of the body and content of the subject. Form follows function, medium is the message, this kind of idea. This is also true of rabbinic literature, right? So if this is a literary truism, it's true about all literature. It's also true of rabbinic literature, and of course, of the Torah. Repetition, stylistic oddities, and variations are not incidental, nor do they aim merely to achieve aesthetic effect, but rather to convey a message or teaching." Now, I'll just pause for a moment here to say that depending how far we go with this is not universally agreed upon. In fact, one way in which people sometimes kind of classify various parshanim is, various of the commentators, is sort of how much they subscribe to this approach. Some people would call this approach omni-significance, right? That there's a deeper message or something that we're supposed to learn from all kinds of variation, whereas a person could alternatively say, even in the Torah, that there are variations that are actually there to achieve, aesthetic effect. The Ramban in some places says this, that the Torah uses, slight changes in its language in one place than another, not because there's actually a substantive difference in meaning, but because literary variation is, valuable in and of itself. So that's she's taking a stance on this debate and arguing that, in fact, every slight change conveys a message or a teaching, when it may, in fact, be part of the Torah's being literarily diverse and just not choosing to always speak in exactly the same language or idiom. But she stakes out her position and now uses that to introduce a particular instance. Let us examine the initial phrases of the passages of the various types of tzara'at. So now we're going to make our way all the way back to the beginning of Tazria, chapter 13, and then fast forward into our parasha. So we have Adam ki yeh be'or besaro, nega tzara'at ki tihiyeh be'adam. You can see the bolded ki tihiyeh or ki yihiyeh phrases in each one. And we'll for clarity's sake, we'll fast forward to the English of each one. When a man shall have in the skin of his flesh, when the plague of tzara'at is in a man, the flesh also, the skin of which has on it a pox. If a man also or a woman have in the skin of their flesh, the garment also in which is the plague of tzara'at. And then to our parashah, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I give the plague of tzara'at in a house of the land of your possession. We note at first, she tells us, how different the introduction to the tzara'at of houses is from all the others. And again, it's actually, of course, clear in the Hebrew, where every single one is introduced with ki yihiyeh or ki tihiyeh. And then all of a sudden, when it comes to tzara'at of the houses, we're told, v'natati negat tzaraat. But even in the English, you get a feel for it, when it will happen, or describing the situation where it is, um, describing, various places on the skin, on garments. And then all of a sudden, when we come to tzaraat of houses, we're told, yes, also when you come into the land, but then we're told a sort of declaration. And I give the plague of tzaraat. There's a much more of an active role of God here as opposed to just describing it as taking place. So we notice at first glance again how different the introduction to the tzaraat of houses is from all the others. This prompted the Midrash to comment in Sifra 75. This is the main halachic Midrash on Vayikra, called Torah Kohanim, or the Sifra, on our pasuk here. And I gave the plague of tzaraat, v'natati negat tzaraat. Rabbi Yehuda said, the Torah announces to them the tidings that they will be subject to the plague of tzaraat. How does that explain this linguistic variation? So she's going to use the Malbim to explain. Consistent with his linguistic, stylistic approach to the Sifra, the Malbim states, so the Malbim is a much more contemporary commentary who has a comment here on the Midrash and explains at length. Whenever a providential act is related, the term natan, giving, always denotes positive events or such as lead to desirable results. Okay, so when we're talking about something God is doing, and the Torah uses the term, or the Tanakh uses the term natan, that God is giving this thing, then either it's a good thing or it's something that has a good consequence for the Jewish people, right? So, for example, God sending thunder and hail, we wouldn't necessarily call a good thing, but it's a desirable result for Am Yisrael. It's a plague which benefits the Jewish people. Other examples: God shall deliver kings into your hand. I think it's their kings, v'natati malchehem biyadecha, or natan malchehem biyadam, probably. It's only used in a creative context to denote persistence. For example, and I will make Jerusalem heaps, and I will make the land desolate, i.e., this state will persist a long time. Okay, so when it's not good, then it somehow has the sense of giving something over into a long-standing state. So we get from the Malbim again a sense that the term v'natan, or natan, when used with God, has very particular intentions, mostly positive or otherwise to denote something which persists for a long time. The use of the term v'natati, we're still in the Malbim, regarding tzaraat, prompted Rabbi Yehuda to consider the plague in a positive light as a medium for the elimination of sin and iniquity. So now the Malbim is going back and saying, what is Rabbi Yehuda saying here when he says the Torah announces that they will be subject to the plague of tzaraat? What's that adding? If we understand how the verb natan is used, and we know that it's generally a good thing, then we understand that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that somehow the fact of the plague of tzaraat on houses is good news. And what's that good news? Because something about tzaraat on houses is a medium for the elimination of sin and iniquity. Okay, we'll file that as we go along. Let us bear in mind Maimonides and Nachmanides' denial that the tzaraat of houses is a natural phenomenon of decay which erodes the walls. We do not associate it with fungus covering the plaster and penetrating into the walls until they crumble. Okay, so kind of consistent with our general way of understanding tzaraat, it's not a simple, physical manifestation of something kind of inside nature, but it's a symbolic message of some kind. The Rambam and the Ramban both agree that tzaraat of houses is not just erosion or fungus. Rather, tzaraat is a divine signal to the straying soul to return to the way of the Torah, a sublime manifestation of God's desire to bring the sinner back to God. Midrash Ruth Rabbah, quoted earlier, states that God, earlier meaning in the previous essay, states that God does not at first punish the sinner directly, but smites his house with tzaraat. It is now clear why Rabbi Yehuda considers, and I will give you the plague of tzaraat in a house of the land of your possession, a sign of divine benevolence, right? Because it's giving you an early warning signal, a chance to recognize that you're doing something wrong and be a medium for the elimination of sin and iniquity before the tzaraat gets closer to you, that is to say, to your clothing or to your body. So she's sort of putting this Midrash Root Rabbah in conversation with Rabbi Yehuda's comment in the Sifra to explain why the Torah uses the language of V'natati negat tzarat, to emphasize that, again, nobody wants tzarat on their house, but that there's a benefit to it, and that it gives you an opportunity at an earlier stage to recognize something's gone astray, figure out what that is, and try to remedy it before it's too late. And thus, broadly, we can think of it as something good God is doing for us. Vayikra Rabbah 17:2 explains how the punishment fits the crime measure for measure. Now she's on to, I think, a related but slightly different dimension here. The increase of his house shall depart, and his goods shall flow away in the day of God's wrath. Pasuk from Eov. His possessions will be taken out of the house on the day when God's wrath burns against that man. How so? A man says to his neighbor, "Lend me a kav of wheat," and he replies, "I do not have any." "Lend me a kav of barley." "I do not have any." "A kav of dates." "I do not have any." A woman says to her friend, "Lend me a strainer." "I do not have one." "Lend me a sieve." "I do not have one." What does God do? God smites the house with tzarat, and the owner brings out his utensils and goods. Then the people ask, "But did he not say that he had nothing? See how much wheat, how much barley, and how many dates he has. Accursed the house which harbored all of this." Okay, so we have some idea here that the particular wrongdoing that Sarat of the house is somehow coming to respond to is a dishonest lack of generosity, a lack of forthrightness or transparency, and therefore the punishment fits the crime, that you then get Sarat on your house, which results in having to take everything out of your house. That's part of the process, so that then the Kohen can come and really examine it. And as a consequence, you're sort of shown up for the ungenerosity that you have displayed. That's sort of, okay, part two, a related piece, but not exactly the same. So first section that she's pointing out to us of kind of rabbinic commentary on the V'natati negat tzarat is to show that it's a sort of divinely benevolent early warning sign. Second, to show us how the sages thought what they thought, what act of wrongdoing they thought it was responding to, and the way in which it was measure for measure. And now we're going to see a third point. In Sanhedrin 71a, our sages say, "There has never been, nor will there ever be, a house smitten with tzarat." This is something we may be familiar with from a couple of other laws in the Torah, about which we're told, "Lo haya v'lo nivra," it never was and never will be. And then the sages ask there, why then was the law given, right? So why do we have the halacha of tzarat on houses if it was never meant to, or it would never actually take place? Drosh v'kabel schar, to study it and be rewarded for studying it. This is explained at length by Sforno. We quote part of his comment. The garment also in which there is the plague of tzarat. Okay, so this is the starting point for Sforno, is tzarat of garments. And he explains. This takes a little while to get through the Sforno. For man is the only creature endowed with a free will. When he ponders God's presence, majesty, and loving kindness, who deals charitably and justly, having realized this, he will walk in God's ways and identify with God's wishes. Verily, such a person, more than any other creature, can be likened to God. Indeed, he constitutes the goal of creation. As it is stated, the righteous is the pillar of the universe. Okay, so there are certain kinds of, I think this is speaking about humans in general, but we're going to see also in particular, we're thinking about, humans who walk through the world with intentionality and the desire to channel the divine spirit that's in them for good. So if with that free will, they use it for good, and identify with God's wishes in the world, that person is very godly and is the goal of creation. But when his deceitful heart leads him astray, and he follows entirely or partially his lustful desires and passions, and neglects his creator or even rebels against him, he will be liable to divine chastisement. As it is stated, "For I will not justify the wicked." And if he sins inadvertently, he will be punished materially or bodily, according to divine wisdom, in order to bring him back to the right path. However, Those who are in deep slumber and totally unaware of their duties and do not endeavor to acquire knowledge, their lives will undoubtedly take their natural course, i.e., without the cautions and chastisement of the wondrous individual providence. Okay, so thus far he seems to be laying out for us this kind of distinction between people who understand their kind of godly spirit in them and then, try to do the right thing. They are a fulfillment of God's purpose in creation. And then if they do the wrong thing, being people who understand what their purpose is supposed to be, if on purpose or inadvertently they do the wrong thing, God actually, in some providential, personal way, punishes them because God actually wants to restore them to the right path because they have the capacity to really make a difference. So God is invested in their, in their outcome in the world. There's a broad theology that's being presented to us here, as opposed to people who are just kind of sleepwalking through the world. God is sort of indifferent to their presence as well and just doesn't invest anything in their lives, doesn't intervene in a positive way, doesn't intervene in a negative way. When the majority of the people follow God's ways, God in God's mercy singles out certain individuals and warns them by means of tzarat on their garments. And if this has not achieved its object, they will be reminded of their sinful behavior through an entirely unnatural phenomenon, tzarat on the house walls. Okay, this is different, by the way, than the Midrash, which sees it going in a different order. Since the generations failed to attain this high level, and therefore did not merit this divine compassion, there is no record of the incidents of the tzarat of houses. Some of our sages thus remarked that they never existed. Okay, so when people are, again, the sort of magnify or scale up this idea of individuals to the idea of the nation, when the nation is on a kind of high enough plane, there are enough people in Am Yisrael that are, again, conscious of their purpose, conscious of their divine, spirit, and therefore intentionally trying to do the right thing. So, then God will choose some from amongst them when things are going astray, to deliver tzarat in order to guide them back to the right path as part of guiding the nation back to the right path. And if tzarat on the garments doesn't work, then tzarat on the house, which is an entirely unnatural phenomenon and therefore indicative of God's providence. That's, again, following the scaled up model of people who are conscious of their purpose and make the most of it. But if the generation or the nation is the equivalent of the sleepwalkers, not really invested in understanding who we are and trying to make the most of our lives, then God doesn't intervene to kind of deliver any messages to us. And therefore, even if we are behaving wrongly, God doesn't kind of try to set us back on the right path, and therefore there's no record of the incidents of tzarat of houses. And that's the Sforno's explanation of why it is that some of the sages remarked that it never existed, because it's indicative of the fact that the generations were not on a high enough level that God would actually intervene. Where this leaves us in terms of understanding what the Sforno thinks of divine providence in the world or for the Jewish people over our history is not totally clear, but worth further exploration. Okay, going on a little further. But what is the meaning of study and be rewarded for studying it? We are expected to study the subject and its message and derive the proper individual and social lessons. So even if we take this Sforno for why it never happened, but still there's something to learn from the existence of this idea, of this system. In his work on allegory in rabbinic literature, Yitzchak Heinemann points out that the Midrashim on halachic texts of the Torah do not abound with allegorical interpretations, and whenever we encounter them, they are never meant to supplant the plain meaning of the text, as against the Christian doctrine of spiritualizing Torah commandments by means of exclusively allegorical interpretations, right? So when we look at Midrashim commenting on halachot in the Torah, they generally don't interpret them as with any kind of allegorical interpretation. They just, interpret them as providing more and more details for how we're supposed to actually carry them out. Allegorical interpretation is not a feature of halachic sections of the Torah, and not necessarily to intentionally contrast, but as opposed to Christian doctrine where Torah commandments become interpreted allegorically or symbolically. The verse is related to the tzarat, smitten house, cleared of its contents, lest the tzarat spread before being examined by the priest, who may order the removal of its stones and even total demolition. All this lends itself to allegorical interpretation. Okay, so once we have said that it never existed, then the midrashic analysis of it is kind of, although it's exceptional and unusual, freed up to interpret it symbolically or allegorically. And now she wants to provide us with some of those symbolic or allegorical interpretations. Al-Shich elaborates on the moral lessons of divine mercy in that no demolition is prescribed upon the initial appearance of a blemish. Thus, all of us should endeavor to improve the situation as soon as a breach in the communal walls occurs or an individual begins to falter. Then he that owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, when a person cultivates evil talk, the owner of the house denotes the man, whereas he that owns the house is the soul that dwells within. Kind of opposite of what we would imagine. The house is the person, and the owner of the house is the soul. And tell the priest, i.e. God, it seems to me there is, as it were, a plague, kanega, in the house. The man in whom I, the soul, dwells is becoming tainted with sin. What are the priest's, that's God's, instructions? Let him empty the house of all unclean iniquity before the priest comes to judge and destroy. Moreover, this is to prevent the spread of his sin's uncleanness, so that all that is in the house be not made unclean. Right? So this is the Al-Shich basically saying the fact that when you first see a blemish, you're not told to destroy the house, but rather to empty the house before it gets evaluated, is an indication that when you have the earliest signs of wrongdoing, you have a chance to kind of clear it out, clean it out, before it spreads and before a greater punishment is due. Then the priest examines the house and sees that the plague has not receded, that the man has not become clean. Indeed, the walls have affected his innermost soul as he had affected his slandered victim. And we're imagining here that the classic rabbinic assumption that tzarat is a punishment for lashon hara, for evil talk. Indeed, the walls have affected his innermost soul as he had affected his slandered victim. For just as his evil tongue caused the latter's complexion to change, on being slandered he blushes and then turns pale, so now changes of color appear on his skin, a stigma of sin on his soul. Then the priest shall go out of the house, i.e., according to the Zohar, the Shechina within man departs from him when he resorts to evil talk. Thus the priest shall go out, the Lord out of the house, i.e., out of this man. However, God remains near, departing to the door of the house, ready to re-enter as soon as the sinner mends his ways. Right? So the next phase is sort of, we see the presence of the tzarat on the house, and the priest goes out and sort of waits to see what's going to happen next. And so too there, when we do the wrong thing, God is kind of vacates to the threshold and is waiting to see whether we're going to mend our ways or not. However, if the tzarat spreads after the 7 days of isolation, the sole remedy is to extirpate the evil from the community. They shall take away the stones in which the plague is. However, degeneration and corruption may have progressed so far that only radical measures remain, right? So the first attempt is to try to extract the kind of blemish, the wrongdoing, the sin kind of which is localized. But if it has spread further, then he shall break down the house, the stones of it, and its timber, and all the mortar of the house, and carry them out of the city into an unclean place. Al-Shich notes, in Jeremiah's message also, that the rooting out and pulling down precedes the rebuilding of the house. Okay? Yeah. So we continue on in the Al-Shich, and he points out that Jeremiah, this is Some of us here on this Zoom are regulars for Thursday morning Jeremiah, where we very, very often we're on chapter 31, and probably every 4 or 5 weeks we circle back to chapter 1, verse 10. This is Jeremiah's charge, and the verbs that are used here repeat themselves intermittently throughout the book, and they sort of, link us back to Jeremiah's mission. What God says to him in his initiation prophecies are, "See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms, lintosh v'lintots, ulaha'avid v'laharos, livnot v'lintoa." And this is very important. "I have set you this day over the nations, over the kings, to root out and pull down, to destroy and throw down, to build and to plant." This is important broadly for an understanding of Jeremiah, that he is not only a prophet of gloom and doom, not only a prophet of destruction, but also of rebuilding. And the Al-Sheikh is sort of pointing out correctly that these tend to be sequential, that after destruction, there is the opportunity yet to rebuild and replant. So when we have those same verbs in the at least we have a vinatats, that same description as vilin totes, of kind of pulling down, that's used for the house. It's sort of like going forwards in the Tanakh. It can be interpreted as kind of taking us to the awareness that there will be an opportunity after vinatats, even that house where the evil and the sin has spread so much so that it now needs to be destroyed. That is meant still to be not a final thing, but a prelude to rebuilding. So she says here, Al-Sheikh sees in our parashah the individual who has strayed, the stages of instructions, and ultimate divine punishment. And then she also, again, points out here, and the possibility, or through the Al-Sheikh, then the possibility of rebuilding, which follows. Okay, last section, then we'll hear any thoughts or reactions. Okay, so this is Al-Sheikh sees in our parsha, the individual. The Midrash sees in the same parsha the stages of Jewish history until the destruction of the temple, as also a message of comfort, the rebuilding of the third and eternal temple. Okay, so where the Al-Sheikh interpreted Tzarat HaBayit, again, taking one step back to remind ourselves that, here, because the take of the sages is that this never really occurred, then it's even more freed up for allegory. We don't sort of have the conflict of, interpreting a practical halacha as allegorical. If we accept the premise that it has no practical, ramifications, then we're even more freed up to interpret it allegorically. And so we have the Al-Sheikh's allegorical interpretation that refers to the individual, and now the Midrash's allegorical interpretation at the national. And that's here. "And I will put the plague of Tzarat in a house of the land of your possession." This refers to the temple, as it is stated, "Behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the pride of your strength. And he that owns the house shall come." This refers to the Lord, as it is stated, "Because of my house that lies waste. And tell the priest." This refers to Jeremiah, as it is stated of the priests who were in Anatot, or Jeremiah is a priest. And the declaration that the owner of the house says to the priest, "It seems to me there is, as it were, a plague in the house." This is God then saying to Jeremiah, the obscenity of idolatry is meant by this, as it is stated, "And behold, northward at the gate of the altar, this image of jealousy in the entry." Okay, so we're imagining God turning to Jeremiah and saying, the house is profane. There's idolatry in the house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house. And he, Shishach, king of Egypt, took away the treasures of the house of the Lord. Okay, so the priest commands that they empty the house is a kind of foretelling of the emptying out of the Beit HaMikdash. "And he shall break down the house," refers to Nebuchadnezzar, who Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, destroyed this house. "And he shall carry them out of the city, and carried the people away to Babel." It's interesting because we certainly have evidence also of some of the Klei HaMikdash being carried away, But here we sort of shift back and think about the ultimate kind of emptying out of the house is not even just about the treasures of the house, but about the people who inhabit the house. That's sort of the almost the most essential aspect of the Beit HaMikdash, is the people who are there, and they are carried out as well. But the Midrash concludes, but it will not be forever, for it is stated, and they shall take other stones. And as the prophecy states, therefore, thus says the Lord God, I lay in Zion for a foundation a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believes shall not make haste. So the Midrash ends by reminding us that, yes, the Beit HaMikdash will be destroyed, but there will be a rebuilding, consistent again with that Jeremiah's layout, that following on the heels of destruction ultimately is rebuilding. So here we got a chance to see through Nechama a recognition kind of the need to, when we look at a particular passage or section, kind of look at the topic sentences, line them up, and compare them stylistically. And when we do that, we would notice in the case of Tzarat, an absolute consistent introduction of each kind until we get to Tzarat Habayit, until we get to the Tzarat of the house, which has this more declarative and the sense of God giving it. We took to the Midrashic approach explained by the Malbim, that says that giving is somehow a positive thing. How could we view the giving of Tzarat as a positive thing? If we understand it as this divine early warning sign, then it's an opportunity for us to mend our ways before the destruction gets worse. We had the kind of a bit of an aside, but the interpretation of the Midrash and Vayikra Rabbah that particularly Tzarat Habayit comes for people who are stingy with their possessions and dishonest about what they have, and therefore ultimately their punishment for not giving and not saying that they do have is that everything they do have will have to be brought out of the house and kind of brought to light, and they'll be kind of exposed for their ungenerosity and untruthfulness. And then we shifted to the idea that Tzarat Habayit never took place, and therefore its purpose is to study it and be rewarded for studying it. We had the interpretation of the Sforno that this idea of its never taking place was indicative of kind of a lower state of the generations, such that God didn't see us as aware, conscious, deliberate, intentional enough people for divine providence to really get involved in trying to help us mend our ways with these warning signs like Tzarat. Really fascinating kind of framework of the Sforno. Again, not that there might not have been individuals, but that the nation wasn't majority of the nation wasn't consistently at enough of a level of intentionality to warrant kind of God's intervention in these kinds of ways. And then on the study and be rewarded for studying, we had this concept of halachic texts not being interpreted midrashically as allegory, unless they're sort of free of halachic content. And if we understand this midrash, the Tzarat Habayit to be free of halachic content, then we're able to interpret it allegorically much more freely. And we have the Al-Shich's individual level allegorical interpretation of the kind of process of repairing oneself before things get worse, and in particular around the sin of Lashon Hara. And then the national version, which has to do with kind of God ultimately warning through Yirmiyahu, it not being heeded, the temple being destroyed, but yet will be rebuilt. That's Tzarat Habayit for us. Questions, comments, thoughts? Judith, go ahead, and then we'll come to Lance.
As you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me is if the Torah brings out an object that has saras as opposed to the body as the kind of early warning signal, why a house? Why not the food? Why not the water? Why not some other object? So, which leads to the question is, where else in the Torah is bayit referred to, in what context, and what symbolism does it have? I don't have an answer to that, but that's the question that came up.
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know if I have a ready answer to it either. I mean, when I hear bayit, I do think about and now we're getting seasonal. The Korban Pesach was, eaten in the bayit, and that was sort of became the sort of unit of gathering place for these small micro communities. In those cases, the bayit actually, it was thought maybe you would be able to eat a Korban Pesach with your bayit, but if your bayit wasn't big enough, then you invited people in, and the bayit sort of became this intermediate space between the family and the nation. That's one place that sort of jumps to mind. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's certainly one thing about bayit is that it does lend itself, and we can obviously offer allegorical interpretations of any object, but it certainly lends itself to this sort of like um, body and soul or kind of depth dimension because it is this structure which has kind of an interior to it, but which an interior which is visible, right? You see the walls, which are the interior of the house. You could kind of see them, as opposed to if like you had Sarat inside something else, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see it so easily. But question's better than the answer. I think it is a really interesting question about where else does bayit show up and what does it mean. So thank you. Great. Lance, go ahead.
Given everything you said in the last 40 minutes, how can you have an heroic leper?
Who's the heroic leper you're thinking of?
2 Kings 7.
Yes.
4 of them.
Yes. Is that the Haftorah that we read for Tazria Metzora when it's not combined with something else? We're going to miss it this year for Shabbat Hagadol, but yes. So yes. So
how ironical! That's the one that we miss. I mean, we missed the Jeremiah one, where Jeremiah says that if God is, I am God and you are my people, you have to listen to God. And if you don't listen to God, things are going to go very bad for you, right?
Yeah.
Now, here we have one in which the whole concept of leprosy is, in effect, undermined, isn't it? When you have 4 lepers who are good guys, heroes, saving the day,
right.
The Lone Ranger coming in, the cavalry, right? Doesn't make any sense to me, except that if you begin to look at this very carefully and you look at the concept that the leprosy in the walls is a fiction, right? Doesn't that equally mean that the Kohanim are a fiction?
I don't think
saying
so.
Saying that a Kohen is God, what does that do to the Kohen? See what I was getting at here?
Yeah, well, but again, let's remind ourselves that this is the allegorical interpretation of the role of the priest in Tzarat Habayit, in House Tzarat. I don't think I don't assume that the same suggestion was made for other forms of Tzarat. So the Kohen functions as a regular Kohen in the other cases on garments,
also,
on bodies.
Doesn't Maimonides come out with a metaphor thing? Doesn't he read the Torah metaphorically?
I think he definitely reads some sections and reads some things that look on the face of them like narratives. He reads as prophecies and some things as allegories. Absolutely. But I don't know how much I'm inclined to assume, although I don't know for sure, that he doesn't interpret laws that way. Maybe some narratives, but I don't think he interprets laws allegorically.
No, I totally agree. I mean, that's true. All I'm doing is I'm suggesting that there are things here that sort of don't add up in a way. Just like if you launched a massive attack and you had a 99% success ratio against all kinds of missiles and drones, that doesn't seem to add up to me either.
Okay, fair. I'll just go back for one moment to say one thing about the heroic lepers. I think I agree that that warrants a little more exploration how that fits here. for the Sforno's framework, maybe they were good people gone astray.
Yeah. Can I?
Yes.
Sarat is do I have the, yeah, I have, I'm not muted, okay. So it's very specific, and they talk about, particularly about Lashon Hara, but it's a specific kind of sinning. So it doesn't mean that it's an evil person. And the other thing is, if we're talking about Sarat as a warning, a person has to have some amount of goodness to be able to get the warning, and to accept the warning, and to read the warning. So I don't see a conflict there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking in a similar direction. Okay, let's go to Bracha. Go ahead.
The other thing is,
yes, back to you,
a
Lance.
blemish can be created by man and believed by rabbis and kahanim, as in Kamsa and Bar Kamsa.
True. I agree. I accept. Bracha, go ahead. We don't hear you yet. Go ahead and unmute.
Just looking at the word bayit, it starts with Beis Yud, which is B, which I think one of the interpreters alluded to it being within you. So B, yes. It means within me. And then just a very simple gematria on bayit would be, in the simplest form, it would be in number order, it would be Taf Yud Beis. And Taf I always think of as a future tense when it's at the beginning of a word. And Yud Beis reminds me of the 12 tribes, which is the larger community of Israel. So it's like it may be within you, but it affects the entire community.
Wow. Beautiful construction. Wonderful. David wrote in Marie Kondo approach to the house. Yes. Yeah, I guess of assessing our relationship to the products. Do you want to say more there or anything else?
No, I wanted to change the subject.
Okay, please.
I'm glad that Lance noted that it was very possible that this was misdiagnosis by the Kohanim. But only Lance the Kohen can lead us there. But I thought this Sforno was actually very depressing. And I was wondering why Nechama includes it. I mean, she gets to choose what Mefarshim she wants to put in here. And the idea that there are people, just normal, everyday Joe six-packs like us, and God doesn't pay them any mind because they're not at the right level, was sad.
Yeah.
Oop, we froze.
Do you still hear me? We lost David for a moment. Hopefully he'll come back. Yeah. David, you back? Oh, you're muted though. Yeah, no, I think it's really there. I hope I could find it. I don't know exactly where it is. There is, I think there is another essay of Nechama's on kind of divine providence. She cites a Ramban that also points a little bit away from a more expansive sense of divine providence. And I don't know what motivates that. I mean, I associate it more, I think, with her brother, with Yeshayahu Leibowitz, so curious and interesting to see this Sforno. And again, I've never seen this Sforno outside, prior to this context. And I don't know enough to know whether this sort of tracks with a broader view of his, but it really is fascinating. And I agree, a little depressing. Okay, I always think that divine providence is generally like a double-edged sword, right? If we really understand God's involvement in our everyday affairs, then the reality that we see around us that seems so at odds with the structures that we would have imagined in the way the Torah lays things out for us is harder to swallow and make sense of. But making it easier by saying God's not involved in our everyday lives creates all kinds of other problems or challenges. So, big important question. And yeah, the Sforno opens up some of that for us. So glad you brought it back up to our attention. Yeah, Judith, back to you.
I'm
And then-
sorry. I have a response to what was just brought up. A person who doesn't have awareness or concept of God, for that person, God is not involved. Even if God is objectively involved, to that
Right.
person, God is not involved.
Right. So we could just sort of say it from that simple descriptive sense. Yeah. Lance, go ahead.
I want to comment about the other essay by
Which
Rabbi
essay?
Sarna.
Oh, okay. Yes, that we sent around last week.
Have you read her essay on modern orthodoxy?
I don't think so.
No, I did. And at one point, there was a link from that essay to what amounts to another essay, a discussion of female clergy. And you read that essay?
I don't think so, but I'm
Okay.
familiar with the
Because
topic.
yeah, I know. The bottom line of the essay referred by that essay is female clergy, no. However, why did she link me to that essay? See what I'm saying? And in that essay, if you read the essay, it's a very relatively long essay. It talks about all kinds of problems with modernity and halacha and trying to interpret that and the place of women. And for the life of me, Rav Stephen, I can't understand why YCT would have a page devoted to pro-Orthodox LGBTQ and not support female clergy.
I think YCT does support female clergy.
YCT does?
It does not ordain them itself in its own institution, but I think YCT
okay.
is wholly supportive of female clergy. In fact, many of the female clergy in the Orthodox community are work in the shuls where YCT rabbis work. And I think institutionally, we're generally, if not entirely, supportive of female clergy.
Okay, but you don't equate male clergy with female clergy, right? In other words, Rabbani Bracha is allowed to lead services without a minyan, but she ain't allowed to lead services in the bayit in mixed company, right? How's that possible?
That's true. But that's, I guess, that's not a feature of her being a clergy person specifically. It is a feature of our community's halachic approach to women's involvement in tefillah.
Right. And I gather that Hadar, which I think is responsible for the essay you sent us on from Rabbi
Yes.
Hadar is supposed to be an Orthodox egalitarian yeshiva. Is that correct?
Egalitarian, yes. I don't think they would identify as Orthodox. I think they are a non-denominational, halachic egalitarian.
Okay. But you obviously do not support the conservative movement's concept of women as being entirely equal to men when it comes to the functions of the rabbi, the functions of the reading Torah, getting aliyahs, chanting Haftorahs, all those things that go on in conservative synagogues. But to be fair, Park Avenue Synagogue, for example, which is one of the most major conservative synagogues in the world, the first aliyah is called Rishon.
That's more radically egalitarian.
That ain't egalitarian. And that is, what is Vikidashto? The mitzvah of Vikidashto.
Yes. Okay, good. We got off the gender back to the priestly Bible.
Well, that's where we started from.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I'll take the liberty of not answering all the questions, but say that I aspire for our orthodoxy to be more egalitarian than it is, and my neshama and my personal practice are not always in exactly the same places, but I have tremendous respect and gratitude for the Hadar and also the conservative movement's steps in this area, even if I don't I align precisely with all of them in my own practice, and we don't align with all of them in the Bayit. But I think we think of ourselves as allied on the broad view of halacha and kind of broad goals of increasing participation.
What's your position on a partnership minyan?
I feel like I'm on the hot seat tonight. I'll give you this last one. I have not read the halachic literature in a while, but I certainly, at the time of reviewing it, found it to be a convincing argument. I have and do, on the rare occasions that I'm not at HIR, I would daven in a partnership tefillah, and see it also as achieving that value of expanding participation.
So, Rav Stephen, there's never been a partnership minyan at HIR?
We've rented space to Shachar, which was a long-standing partnership tefillah in Riverdale. Some of its leaders and organizers are here. But we have not had under the Bayit sort of formal auspices. We have on Purim mixed reading of Megillat Esther, but we haven't had under the Bayit sort of formal auspices a partnership tefillah. That's where we stand now. Some of this is a balance of where we want to go, where our constituents want to go, and the right timing and pacing of all those questions.
So you don't remember leading Musaf at my granddaughter Galia's partnership minyan in HIR?
Yes, that's subject to our other policy that we allow rentals for private smachot to follow a partnership format.
But you let Musaf.
I did. Back to
and
bracha.
To be honest with you, Rav Stephen, I don't know how many rabbis in the world would put up with me in this context. And not only you put up with me, but you seem to enjoy.
It is a joy. It is a joy, Lance. Thank you. Glad you're here. Bracha, back to you for what I'm guessing might be a final word.
It's actually, it's a different kind of thing.
Great.
I'm just checking with you on the basis of Lance's asking all those halachic questions. I do have a halachic question, which I'm not going to ask you during this session, but which is related to Pesach. And I was wondering, when is a good time to reach you about something?
Yeah, I think you have my number. Just feel free to send me a text and we'll figure out a time to jump on the phone.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right, everybody. We did cover tzaraat of houses before we got on to a wider discussion of the bayits and my own personal halachic outlooks, and hopefully we'll get a chance to, if I can locate some more of Nechama on divine providence, I think that would be a great opportunity to follow that thread a little further. Wishing everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a lot to traverse between now and then. May all our preparation be smooth. May things be as peaceful as they can be between now and then and beyond. And if you have any other Pesach-related needs, don't hesitate to be in touch, or anything else. As you know, love to mom and dad, and take good care all. Good night. Good night.
Yeah, Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, Peter.